12. Crime in America. Crime in America feeds on two unholy urges of human free will: greed and revenge. And that's what we'll find in studying the 20th century portrait of crime in America. It's easy to declare war on crime. This particular newspaper article was written late 20s, early 30s by the Al Capone prosecutor. Nothing like a good war on crime. There are basically two kinds of crime. There's civil law and there's criminal law, but there are crimes against persons and crimes against property in criminal law. And this is what we most often think of is violent crimes. We think of rapes and robberies and burglaries and things like that. We don't think so much about the nice little shoplifting and a 10-cent bag of marijuana or whatever the lesser crimes might be. We think of the big ones. Sometimes these are crimes against property, and it may be your property, it may be your car that is stripped clean. Now usually these are crimes that do not involve human injury or fatality. However, we pay for crime. In your insurance rates, in my insurance rates, we pay for the cost of removing that car from the site and replacing that car or repairing it. It's the nature of crime. We pay for it. Criminals, as you may know, are largely defenseless in the political arena. There are no unions or organizations of prostitutes or drug dealers that make commercials on television or appear with their lobbyists in Washington or the state capitals, but the white-collar criminals do. They have lobbyists. They're very fancy, very slick, and they do great harm, and we pay for their crimes as well. Now, Richard Nixon made famous this law and order slogan in the 1968 political campaign for president. Remember, 1968 was the year that Bobby Kennedy was killed and Dr. Martin Luther King was killed. And after Dr. King was killed, there were riots, understandable race riots, in 120, 130 cities in America. Nixon used those as a backdrop, as a rationale to appeal to the population, at least the white population, with the promise of creating law and order. Nixon won narrowly in 1968 against Hubert Humphrey, but his biggest advantage in 1968 was that he had George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, running as an independent. Wallace actually got 40 electoral votes. Humphrey came awfully close to beating the challenger Nixon, but he did not. Law and order. What a promise. Speaking of law and order, here's Mr. Law and Order himself, J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover was the famous director of the FBI, the first director, 1924, and he held that post until 1972, the occasion of his death. He had a lot to say about crime and its sometimes brutal enforcement during that century. Now, Al Capone was eventually dispatched by a jury and was sent to prison and served time and came out. This particular article is written by that Capone prosecutor, and he poses the question, what do we do after Capone? Now, one of the things we found during Capone's era was that there were crooked politicians. There were cops, there were prosecutors, there were other public officials who could be bought for a price. And the price was especially paid by the bootleggers and the people who ran the speakeasies and those who were involved in the illegal liquor trade between 1920 and 1933 during the time of Prohibition. That initiated a remarkable period of lawlessness in the United States. Some of the more famous crimes of the century were crimes against children, especially the Lindbergh kidnapping. Poor child of Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne child was taken out of the crib, their home in New Jersey, was eventually murdered. After the murder, the kidnapper asked for ransom, which was paid, and then of course much later the Lindbergh baby's body was found. So too it was with those two who came forward and kidnapped Bobby Greenlease. Bobby Greenlease was a young 6-year-old boy in 1953 whose father happened to be a very wealthy automobile dealer in Kansas City. They too killed the child almost immediately. They wandered between St. Joe, Missouri, Kansas City, where the kidnapping took place, and St. Louis. Eventually they caught these two that are featured in this book here. Mr. Greenlease paid $600,000, an enormous sum of money to the kidnappers. Now the interesting thing about the kidnapping and the ransom was that only half of the ransom money was found. Could it be that there were some unfortunately crooked cops who went away with $300,000? It is possible. Some of the crimes are really crimes of society against segments of society. Here's an advertisement that the NAACP, then a very young organization, took in a major Washington newspaper in 1922. This was at the height of the Ku Klux Klan, and there were many lynchings, some in the South and some throughout the country. It was much later that there was finally some legislation that made lynching a federal crime. Now, one of those children who was killed by hate was George Stinney Jr. Here we see his headstone, and his headstone shows the legend that in fact he was exonerated because he was not guilty of killing those two little girls, as he was charged in 1944, hastily tried, hastily convicted, poorly defended, and sentenced to and executed in the electric chair, June 16, 1944. Such haste, such crime of society against a segment of society are especially painful, or they should be painful for us, as was the death of Emmett Till in 1955. Another crime of hate, this one took place in Mississippi. Two white men were charged, were acquitted, and eventually confessed. Their confession was printed as an article in Look magazine by an author named William Bradford Way. You really should read that. I have the citation, the link for that, in the Blackboard readings on Emmett Till. I encourage you to read it. An execution that occurred again by the hand of the state was that of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Julius Rosenberg was charged with and convicted of espionage related to the Manhattan Project, selling, they said, secrets related to the bomb to the Russians, the Soviets. And in fact, Rosenberg likely did some spying. His wife Ethel was blameless and was not guilty. However, she would not testify against her husband, and there was enough circumstantial evidence and enough testimony brought forth in the court that the jury was convinced, and they executed both. The father and mother of these two young boys were both killed that day in the electric chair. We entertain ourselves with images of crime fighters. Some of them are absolutely imaginary, like these two. Bruce Wayne, who turns into Batman, the vigilante millionaire who fights crime, helping the commissioner of Gotham City, and Clark Kent, the mild-mannered reporter who's an extraterrestrial Superman who helps us. Sadly, we don't have such remarkable people helping us in crime fighting. It is the job of ordinary men and women who volunteer, who serve, who create a career in law enforcement. Timothy McVeigh was an especially effective and horrible killer. In 1995, he killed 158 people with the Oklahoma City bombing. He hated and he killed, and he was eventually executed himself. Timothy McVeigh, one of the great mass killers in the United States in the 20th century. John Wayne Gacy had fewer victims. He killed about 27 men and boys, but he gruesomely dismembered their bodies and buried a number of them in the crawl space beneath his house in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. Jeffrey Dahmer, another mass killer of the century. To these men go the archetypal images of crime in our minds. When you talk about crime in the 20th century, you'll think about Gacy, McVeigh, Dahmer. Dahmer, of course, had sad and cannibalistic tendencies, and he had 18 victims, 17 in Milwaukee and 1 in Florida. He was eventually killed in prison by another inmate not long after he began his life sentences. There are, however, among us many nonviolent criminals. They don't come to the top of the mind as Dahmer and Gacy and the others do, but Michael Milken, the so-called junk bond king, who's pictured here, was very effective at stealing money from people. As a matter of fact, Milken was so effective that he'd set aside $200 million to pay for the fines and costs that he knew he would eventually have to bear once he was caught. And caught he was. He was convicted, went to jail, paid the fines and had some money left over, thank you, came out and worked to rehabilitate his image. If you look him up now on the favorite search engine of yours, you'll probably find Michael Milken, convicted swindler and philanthropist. An odd combination for a man in rehabilitation. So too has there been some rehabilitation for Jordan Belfort, the so-called Wolf of Wall Street. He manipulated these initial public offerings. He stole a great deal of money from his clients. He authored this book. He was honored with a portrayal by Leonardo DiCaprio in the famous movie of the same name, The Wolf of Wall Street. These white-collar crimes are hideous and as insidious as the violent crimes, I submit, that Dahmer and Gacy and the others committed. Bernie Madoff, the biggest of all. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, he stole literally billions of dollars from his clients. And some very famous clients too. It's such a shame. Some crimes begin with lawful commodities, such as prescription drugs. Some people have turned prescription drugs, especially the opioid painkillers, into great money-making enterprises. Physicians, pharmacists, unscrupulous people of all sorts have made lots of money in pushing these painkillers, and dealers on the street as well. Now, one of the great lessons about crime is if you're having trouble, what you can do is you can legalize the underlying enterprise. America had a lot of trouble with gambling in the 20th century, so we legalized it. We legalized casino gambling, we legalized blackjack and lottery and slot machines and these other games that were making a lot of money only for the mob. Now they make a lot of money for the state of Nevada and Illinois and Kansas and the other states. And the reason that states embrace these lotteries and legalized forms of gambling, including racehorses and dog races and all this, is not because states have lost their way and lost their sense of morality, although some may have. It's just a great way to collect tax money without raising taxes. The sports book also is now legalized. People can bet on all kinds of games. Now the question is, what do we do with crime? We set laws, we set standards, we set enforcement, we set processes of enforcement, we have prosecutors. Now I'm going to tell you a couple of things that you need to know. One of the great trends in the 20th century was mandatory sentencing. The Congress and also state legislatures created the system by which persons convicted of certain crimes would have to serve mandatory sentences. For some reason, legislators convinced themselves that judges somehow grew soft sitting on the bench, hearing these sad stories of these criminals. Rather, I submit to you, the judges grow more harsh, hearing the same stories about the victims of the crimes. The sad thing is, the judges who could exercise their judgment are sometimes forced into sentences that are inappropriate. Hence, we're depopulating our jails right now with all the people who had mandatory sentences for lesser drug crimes in the 20th century. And I want to remind you of this. My father was a prosecuting attorney in St. Louis, and I know a little something about what's called prosecutorial discretion. The reason that we love crime is because it makes for great television shows, great movies. It makes for great political careers. A lot of these great politicians started off as prosecutors. And what's great about being a prosecutor is you can manage the cases that come to court. And if you use prosecutorial discretion and you bargain down, you get a plea bargain, then you're not going to have to go to court with that. So you can count that as a guilty prosecution. Then your record when you go to court is going to be fewer cases with better evidence against more hideous plaintiffs, defendants, and you will likely keep those numbers up. Now, that's like bargaining away difficult questions in a test, isn't it? But careers are made on prosecutors, television shows are made with crime, and politics is all the richer because we have the criminals to point to. Yes, crime is a problem. Yes, crime is a scourge. Yes, we need a good criminal system with great judges and great policemen. But yes, we also need some sense of reason in our system. We'll see whether we get to that in the 21st century. I submit to you in the 20th, we didn't do so well.